to all the dispossessed youth of Africa, for perpetuation of communion with ancestral spirits through the fight for African freedom, and in the firm faith that the dead, the living, and the unborn will unite to build the destroyed shrines. Selah. And welcome, beloveds, to another episode of Wake Up Africa. My name is Dr. Mumbi. How you doing? How's everything going? I really do pray that you are well in all your ways and that you're moving into living life truly on your own terms, in your own vibe, in your own rhythm. Thanks to every single person that has subscribed to the channel. We appreciate, love you so much. Go ahead and consider subscribing, beloveds, if you haven't already, and make sure you hit that notification button so that you find out every single time we upload a new episode. Thanks to every single person that also emails us. And also, special shout out to our Patreon family. Absolutely. We do release the news on there because I've been getting a lot of emails after the death of the Chad president. A lot of people wanting to know what my take is. I shared that as breaking news, on Patreon and kind of gave my 2 cents. But I thought I'd cover it on this from a spiritual angle, beloveds, because in the last 1 year, 5 of Africa's presidents have been taken out. Could you imagine if the same thing happened in Europe, where 5 European presidents were, died within the space of a year? It's not normal. And we have to see that the Great Reset, especially how it's going to evolve and take shape on the African continent, is quite different. The agenda they have for us is quite different. It's a neo-colonial agenda. Many actually on the continent feel that the whole pandemic was about slowing Africa down. And it's always about us, beloveds. It's always been about us. And if you look, before the pandemic, I think 5 out of the 10 top, fastest growing nations were on the continent. And now, we're back. Many were getting free from debt, etc., starting to assert themselves in mining and various different industries, trying to claim their power back. And then boom, the pandemic happened. And then now we're literally back, especially countries like Kenya. We're literally back to the 90s when there was, a scramble for Africa. This is the new scramble for Africa. And they told us in 2019 and 2020, I think 2019, I really covered this a lot, where they were talking about dividing Africa anew, China becoming a new player. We saw Russia coming into Africa. We even saw Turkey, beloveds, coming into Africa. So there is a reset, and the great global reset is very different from the reset that they're trying to have in Africa. They're trying to reset us back to the dictatorial, total neo-colonial control by the puppet masters. They're either going to do it through regime change, or they'll do it through economic manipulation and control, like in Kenya. I mean, our debt went from 1.7 trillion maybe a couple of years ago to 7 trillion. And now the World Bank is coming into our government and telling us, you need to privatize this, you need to do that. This is what happened in the 90s, beloveds. You really need to research. If you're interested in what, the trends of Africa, the structural adjustment programs that the World Bank and the IMF came up with. And what happened with those programs is that a lot of our resources were privatized. That's when our water was privatized. And they got us in the debt trap. You see what China's doing? Babylon did it first. In the 90s, they borrowed they lent money to all these dictators that were in Africa to run these massive governments, colonial governments that they had left in place. And then as the debt increased, of course, the corruption, they started giving personal handouts. When the debt reached a certain level, they actually owned the country, and then they started to dictate, privatize your electricity, privatize your telecom. That's why the British telecom owns, the local one of the Kenya's biggest and maybe East Africa's biggest telecom, Safaricom. It's because we had to privatize this. Many nations had to privatize this. And this is how we lost many of our resources after we'd struggled to get them. So we've never been free, because you cannot be free in a Babylon system, in a Babylon government. But now, So, aside from the economic kind of entrapment that they're doing for willing leaders like our own here, the other thing they're doing is that if you don't play ball, they are literally taking you out. Beloveds, we've lost 5 presidents. Not that these presidents really, were doing anything for many of them were already puppets. But, the thing is, before, as puppets, you could say yes, no, yes, no. Now, the Mzungu only wants a yes, one no, and you get kicked out. And so there is a lot of fear and apprehension among the African presidents that still have, their mental faculties together. But beloveds, listen to this. Let me just go through the people, First of all, the Ivory Coast president, Hamed Bakoyoko, he actually passed on 3rd March. And then 2 weeks later, literally, Tanzanian President John Magufuli passed on 17th March. And last year, beloveds, remember Burundian president where there was a quick election and then the next thing we saw, the president had died, Pierre Nkurunziza. He died on 8th June. And Swaziland president, Ambrose Ndlamini, he also died in December. And now we have Idris Deby, Chad president, who had gone to the rebel front lines to see what was going on, and he was taken out. But the 4 previous presidents I just mentioned, they all opposed the pandemic and were trying to protect their people. And they have now been replaced by more compliant people. But as I've said, beloveds, we can influence these leaders with our spiritual energy. If enough people collectively are sending a certain vibe to a president, that will tip the balance. But I'll definitely get into that later on. But you see, what's happened, beloveds, is that if you also look, a lot of the presidents, all these 5 presidents, they had just survived an election. And that's what the government, so they'll try and get you financially. If they don't get you financially, then they'll try and get you through the election. And that's why you'll see all this negative stuff about the leaders they don't want and how they're like this and they're like that. And then if you survive the election, then they will take you out. These are really perilous times, beloveds. And it's not so much, as I was saying earlier, that these leaders are for us or they were puppets or whatever, but it's an attack on our sovereignty as an African nation. How can we have lost 5 African presidents, beloveds, in a year? And what's happening actually is that, in France, I've been looking at a lot of tweets after this guy was, after Idris Deby was taken out. And there was a tweet, there's some people who I follow, this guy's called Onyen Kuzi, and he was talking about how France has actually managed to change, to transition, from father to son in various regimes. Like when the father became difficult, something happened to the father and the son took over. It started with Yadema of Togo. He was replaced by his son, Faure Ganisingbe. There's also Omar Bongo Ondimba. He was replaced by his son, Ali Bongo Ondimba. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing these names. And now Idris Deby has been replaced by his son. Why are their sons, why are they being replaced by their sons? Is it because the son is more willing to follow orders than the father? Can we hope that the sons will actually try and, fight the regime? Mamba! My neighbor, he always comes to see, what I'm doing. But, and now Chad actually has their youngest 37-year-old head of state. So what is really going on, beloveds? Who is taking out our African presidents? It's the colonialists, because they never left. Colonialism never ended, beloveds. That's the truth right now. And they are removing even the mildest of gatekeepers who were on their side before. Anyway, let's take a short break. We'll be right back.
Wake up, wake up, wake up, wake up, wake up. Wake up, Africa.
Welcome back, beloveds, to Wake Up Africa. My name is Dr. Mumbi Saraki. How you doing? How's everything going? So who is killing our African presidents? I think it's very important to understand what is going on because, we never gained liberation. You can't gain liberation and keep the same oppressive colonial system. The fact that we kept the colonial governments in place, the fact that we didn't even create our own system, even of health, of education, etc., shows you that the colonialism, the war was never won. It was diverted, it was shifted because by the time we were fighting for independence in the 50s, many people were already mentally colonized. So it's just the colonialism moved from physical to mental. And now we're witnessing the phase two of the neo-colonial agenda. And, the news has just come out about how France is actually was behind the genocide. It was, they're saying it was a missed call, etc. But, and that they had a hand in the genocide that took place in Rwanda. You guys need to check who was really behind that. Definitely a foreign hand. But, France was also behind the eco because France is a third world country, beloveds. The only thing they had is the taxes of the African nations. And if you look carefully, you'll see all the people that were, speaking out against France and, what France was doing with the colonial tax. Many of them have been pushed aside, eliminated, taken out, however you want to put it. And now France is like doing that. They're doing generational changes where they're replacing the father with the son. They've done it with three presidents as I listed. Although many are thinking the fourth will be Paul Biya, where they will regime change from the son, from the father to the son. But this is a very perilous time to be an African president because if you are a puppet and an agent of the West, then you are extremely, you're extremely exposed because now the West isn't going to accept you say yes on some things and no on some things. No, it's going to be yes. The day you say no, you get taken out. I think a lot of African presidents have that apprehension, but many are in too deep because I told you, if they don't get you economically, like now they have Kenya in their pocket economically, where now the World Bank is going to start dictating to us what our policies should be and what our priorities should be. And then they'll start saying, privatize your mines, privatize this because you've borrowed money from them. It's like taking a mortgage and you don't pay. They'll come for your car. They'll come for your house. That's where we find ourselves as a Kenyan people. And it's very frustrating because we're seeing that our governments aren't able to even speak out on the most basic abuses of our land. Like what happened with the 10,000 acres that was destroyed by the British Army. Can you imagine the Kenyan government never commented? But now 5 presidents gone in a year, beloveds. It's because now there's a new play. The global reset it's also a global reset for Africa, and they have a specific agenda for Africa. Just like they sat in 1884 and carved out the different African nations for the different European powers, they are now doing the same thing, but there's new players at the table. Russia is at the table. Turkey is at the table. China is at the table, and and people have been saying the war of Armageddon will be fought in Africa, World War III will be fought in Africa, and sadly, as we continue to believe these things, those things gain momentum. But if you look at, there's a certain Twitter handle I follow, and the guy's called Military Nigeria or something like that. You can find him if you go through my page at Dr. Mumbi Saraki. And he was talking about how the next few months are going to be an extremely interesting time for Africa because France has been preparing for a high-intensity war. They've actually even been carrying out surveys, trying to find out if their citizens would be ready, for something. And this is what he says. Africa is heating up, folks. Strap on your seatbelts. It's going to be an interesting period for Africa in the coming months. The French military is planning for high intensity war. Its armed forces is beginning to prepare for the return of a major conflict, etc., etc. And he says, a full-scale divisional exercise on a scale that will involve full range of, French military capacity, 20,000 soldiers, etc., etc. And he goes on and on talking about how they made sure Nigeria was destabilized, because Nigeria is like, the protective force in the West African region. And they've done so much. He's actually called at Defense Nigeria. Definitely go check out what he has to say. And he's talking about how France, they can go to Europe because Germany and Russia are there. They can't go to Asia. So where are they coming? Here. But I think it's actually deeper than that. I think that, they never left, beloveds. Colonialism never ended. What they found is it was easier to have us as wage slaves than as slaves that they beat up. And, it was better to use soft power than hard power, where they're killing you off if you're not agreeing, etc., etc. And now France has been behind everything, beloveds. They control the eco. There was that whole global movement against, the African nations that still till today pay African colonial tax. And a few of the presidents started saying that they wanted to change that because majority of French nations keep their reserves in France, etc., etc., of African nations, former African colonies. So they wanted to, so a lot of countries were wanting to change that. And now, France has actually changed, triggered generational transition from father to son. In 3 nations, now it's in Chad with Idris Deby. Many feel it will also happen with Paul Biya, who's been, I don't even know if he's a clone or not. But I say this to say, beloveds, that the time for us, if we look at this whole situation, sorry, there's a helicopter going by. It's actually circling, so I just hope it won't interfere too much. That's so weird, man. I think this one is actually Kenyan Army, but anyway, there's some army folk who were like, yo, there was a helicopter the other day, and they were like, that's a fighter, I don't know what. Anyway, the reason I share this, beloveds, is because if you look at the situation physically, you can see that the Babylon system is preparing for a new form of control for our people. And we must fight as much as we must fight it, but we can't physically, because even the one who holds the keys, the people who hold the keys to our nation are in the pockets of these Westerners. So we must continuously pray and chant and, send out dots. Your mouth is extremely powerful. Write affirmations that Africa will be free in our generation, that Eden will be restored. And it's time for people to speak out that, may the French regime and all regimes that have, nefarious agendas for Africa be exposed. And also let's fight. Let's also speak against the fact that so many of our people, we have this it's like there's a spell of forgetfulness. Like we'll cry about the eco and everything that's happening with it. And how the eco currency is now controlled by France, and oh my God, African nations are, still paying taxes to colonial masters, etc., etc. But then in 6 months, everyone forgets because there's this information overload now. But we have to remember, and may justice be served. Like, if there's too many things to cover, just say, we need an African reset before the colonialists. That's what we need, where we knew ourselves. And of course, we're totally different beings. Many of us won't even make it. But the liberation of Africa can only come through spirit, beloveds. And spirit is willing. The God of our ancestors is willing, but we must call on them by even knowing what their name is. Anyway, let me know what you think about this. Who is killing off our African presidents? Until next time, Tuko Pamoda.